I don't want to debate specifically Wiley. I do want to talk about anti-Semitism and why I sense it gets a free pass in many respects. It doesn't sit there in the same kind of way with other forms of discrimination and racism. Free pass is the word. 0344 499 1000. He's refused, Wiley, to distance himself from most of the anti-Semitic comments he posted on social media, but he apologised for generalising after a fallout with his manager, who is Jewish. Have a listen to this.
The music industry batch of people I'm talking about, they're the ones who get to benefit from it. That's what this is all about. It's systemic racism from their side. What do you think? The system and that man and a community of Jewish lawyers and thingy have made me feel that way. Yes, they have. They've made me feel that way. Not anti-Semitic. They've made me feel angry and upset because they are showing me the systemic racism and privilege that they're allowed to use on us.
He's talking about John Wolfe there, his former manager. He was his manager up to the weekend when even John Wolfe thought, hang on about, I can't hang around with this, and legged it and broke the deal they had. I'm assuming before that everything was sort of tickety-boo with him and his manager. Let's speak, in fact, lots to talk about here in terms of Wiley. Let's speak with Stephen Silverman, Director of Investigations and Enforcement at the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Afternoon to you, Steve. Well, firstly, what are you making of the events we've been watching unfold? And now this, not so much a car crash, but almost an entire pile-up of an interview with your man Wiley.
Well, yeah, it was an interesting interview, wasn't it? It's an apology in which he's not remotely sorry and stands by everything he said. And I think we know that in the course of the interview, he said things that actually were not fit for broadcast. And we know this because the interviewer told us that was the case. So, yeah, I mean, I think, Wiley is a case that needs to be dealt with in a number of ways, both through the criminal justice system, through the honour system and social media. I mean, he should not be allowed back on any social media platform while he's capable of broadcasting these views to followers that number almost 500,000.
I mean, he's a good example of the question I raised, I guess, Stephen, which is why does anti-Semitism get a free pass? But because the fact that he was comfortable to double down and repeat his comments, he clearly felt there was nothing wrong with what he was saying.
I think that the answer to your question is a complex one, and I think we can account for it with one general attitude and a set of circumstances that have arisen over the last 5 years. I think the general attitude that is the really, really problematic one is that whereas most forms of racism are dependent upon the idea that the victims are weaker or oppressed and are being punched from above, there is a theory, which is in itself an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, that Jews are all rich, powerful, hold all the aces, and therefore when you attack them, you're punching upwards at oppressors. They cannot be victims. So that's the underlying thread.
Which is interesting, given that, and I mentioned in my intro, I don't know if you were able to hear, but given the terrifyingly recent history of the Jewish people, and I'm talking about the 1930s and Germany, then that in itself is an extraordinary misplaced claim for anyone to make.
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing, and the reason people feel empowered to be able to say that kind of thing now is a phenomenon that has arisen directly from the last 5 years. Anti-Semitism never went away. It was never cured after the Holocaust. It went underground because it was taboo. A number of things have happened in the last 5 years to break that taboo. One is the normalization of anti-Semitic discourse in politics, which we saw under the Corbyn-led Labour Party, in which anti-Semitism almost became a strand of policy. We've seen it on social media, and if we get time, I'd like to come back to Twitter on this, because social media in general, and Twitter in particular, are complicit, entirely complicit in this. by allowing this kind of thing to run free across their platform. All that's happened with Wiley is that it's taken a celebrity with a large following to do this, for them to suddenly sit up and take notice. What Wiley has done is nothing new on Twitter. I've been watching Twitter for 5 years since I joined Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, and believe me, there is far worse that is allowed to reside on their platform and is never taken down, and we are talking directly to Twitter about this. The third thing is the fact that it has proven almost impossible to get this kind of anti-Semitic hate speech, when it takes place on social media, prosecuted. The CPS just will not do it. So you have a loosening of the taboo because of what people have seen taking place in politics. You have a platform in which it's allowed to run free, and you have this understanding that anti-Semites and indeed other racists have, that they're safe, they're not going to be prosecuted. The only time prosecutions for these things have taken place is when Campaign Against Anti-Semitism has had to launch its own private action in the form of private prosecution or judicial reviews. It's
so in fact the system then, Stephen, is also part of the problem here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In terms of, and it's worth distinguishing this, because I've already had lots of people getting in touch saying, hang on a second, if you're having a pop at somebody because of their religion, that might not be big or clever, but why is that racism? Can you explain that situation? I'm sure you've had to explain this before, but what is the reason why anti-Semitism is often described as racism as well? Can you, just for those who are perhaps not quite so familiar with this distinction, what is it?
So there is, and I'm kind of plagiarizing Jonathan Sachs here.
It's okay.
He said that following the Enlightenment, it became unacceptable to discriminate Jews because of their religion. And so the attention turned to race. And at the risk of invoking Godwin's law here, what we saw was the worst crime against Jews in history. The Holocaust was based on race. Religion had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, okay.
It was about Jewish blood. It was about how many Jewish grandparents did you have.
Yeah, they weren't bothered whether you were going to a synagogue once a week. It was all about, yeah, you're right, your DNA. Yeah,
nobody knocked on the door before sending you to the ghetto said, how many times do you go to synagogue? Are you observant? That did not happen. So, and it's also worth noting that it's settled in law that for a number of offences, Jews, as indeed are Sikhs, to be classified as a racial group.
Sure.
So, you know, there's no dispute about the racism here.
Yeah. And it's interesting to clarify that, because as soon as I opened my mouth at the beginning of the show and asked that question, I was mentioning the word racism within my introduction. I got a load of people jumping on me saying, this isn't racism, it might be religious hatred, but it's not racism. And of course, you've clarified brilliantly why it absolutely is. Where does this go next, Stephen? I mean, this fella, you know, gets a chance to have an interview with a national news channel. You might have thought, well, this will be the point where he would say, man, did I mess up over the weekend. It was relentless, but what a great chance I've got now to put it right, be contrite, and you know, at least say sorry. Of course, he didn't do that. He's just made it 100 times worse, because he's essentially repeated what he previously said. Only now we can see him saying it. It looks even more angry on his part. But where does this story continue?
Well, I think there are two strands to this. Firstly, there is no doubt that to his following of almost 500,000, he has repeated the same slurs and lies about Jews that have previously led to persecution on a mass scale. He's called for them to be shot. He's attempting to start a race war between Jews and black people. He needs to be prosecuted for incitement to racial hatred. And the police are investigating, and we'll watch the outcome of that with interest. The Honours Committee needs to revoke his MBE. No person who espouses these views, let alone speaks them so aggressively and publicly, should be able to hold such an honour. Then there's a matter. Sorry.
No, you carry on, Stephen.
And then there's the matter of Twitter and social media in general. I really think this is a watershed moment. We know the Digital Harms Bill is in progress. We know the Culture Secretary has said there needs to be new laws. This should be a wake-up call from them, because, as I said, this is nothing new. That it doesn't take very long. You do not have to scratch the surface of Twitter very deeply to find Holocaust denial, at the same time as denying it, people calling for a new Holocaust, repeating all the anti-Semitic tropes and worse that Wiley did in his rant.
Stephen, powerful stuff. Thank you, sir. Stephen Silverman, Director of Investigations and Enforcement at the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Incredibly powerful stuff. And that last point about how it's still there, another Holocaust, and people advance it, denying the Holocaust. You know, I draw your attention back to what I was saying a second ago about a friend of mine who was telling a story on the radio recently about her grandmother, her husband's grandmother, my own drama teacher at school, Mrs. Feynman, who first taught me about Jewish history and her backstory and her family's backstory. This is in our lifetimes. This is in our life. People around today and the family of who are incredibly close to this. And some, sadly, as close as it can get.